All right, we're back, and we're going to continue on with bringing this Cylon Raider in from Lightwave 2015 to 2024 and see what we get. As we can see, the interface for Lightwave hasn't really changed much over the years, and this is why it's very easy to jump back in and be very comfortable with the software once you understand some of the caveats or little, areas that have shifted quite significantly, so that you can understand them and get your head wrapped around them and realize, well, this isn't such a big deal for me to adapt, but it gives you a lot more power. So let's get this asset in here. We're going to make sure that our content directory is set. So there's our recent content directory. So that's where we're packing things over. Go load scene. And I'm going to load the 2015 version of this, just so we can see what breaks, because I was working on a 2024 edition. And we'll wait for the scene to load up. Boom, boom. Okay, first things first. Let's take a look at this in our scene editor. You're going to notice right off the bat that there have been some changes with how things load up. Like if we go back to the Lightwave 2015 scene, there's subtle interface changes, such as these guidelines for safety and action and title safe have been squared off, and that was something that took place, I think, in the 2018 cycle. We don't need this crosshair in here anymore, so we can get rid of that in a second, and I'll show you the changes to that menu. The surface editor has also lost the little sphere that was in here that would allow you to see what that texture was when you were selecting and seeing the changes when you'd make a little subtle adjustment. Don't worry, it's just in a different place now. It hasn't gone bye-bye. We also know that our lights are not going to come in the same shape here because they are represented by different types of icons, and the way that the lights for say the engines on this were done with distant lights, and we need something that's a little bit more intelligent because distant lights wouldn't really make sense in Lightwave 2024. However, another light type would, and it would actually give us more control and look better. So let's go through this right now. Let's go to the menu that we were discussing in the previous video, which was the options menu, so we can see what the changes are in here. As you can tell, the shape of it and the layout for it has significantly been altered, but all the same stuff is essentially here. In our current scene, for example, we've got options under general for an auto fixed keyframe or full scene parameter evaluation. The viewport, so if you want certain things on or off, for example, I don't want that field chart on anymore, I can get rid of that. I can undock a preview window. We were able to do that in previous versions. Change your view layout. So if you want double up, 4 up, all that's still there. It's just in a different spot for you to find it now. Color space options, very similar tab or window as it was in the previous 2015 video that we just were watching, but it's just got its own little section here. It's all the same stuff, basically. The presets are still all in there, and of course all the drop-down menus work as you would expect. Then we have layout itself, okay? And all the functions for such as how many frames per second you want. This is where you would change that, what you want your slider to be represented as, whether it's frames in time, SMPTE time code, film key code, or time in seconds. That's where that drop down menu is now. Whether you want to work in SI, metric, or English. How many undos you want. I have a really spiffy machine, so I'm going to take the time to set this to like 180. Advanced save options. Where to set your saves for autosaves for objects and scenes. I leave that to never, just because I'm one of those users that doesn't want something saved over arbitrarily by my software. You got your enable master autoload, protect legacy scenes, which is the warning that came up when you initially load. If you're loading a scene from a previous version of Lightwave, it'll give you that warning. Autoscan plugins, clear scene to default, which is kind of handy. You can create a default scene if you want, just as we were given the ability to in, I believe it was Lightwave 11. You can clear to a scene default. that has all the stuff in it that you would normally use in a scene when you start a new scene as a project. If you're doing ArcViz, you probably have certain things in there like a bunch of trees and some street lights or something like that, and start arranging things once you import your other models. For a space scene like this, I'd probably import with Star Pro and maybe some planets or something. That could be a default scene, things like that. And you're enable the image cache function and how much cache you want to dedicate to that. Interface, left or right toolbar positions. This is where you do it now. And then if you want to hide the toolbar, that can be a little bit scary though if you don't know the shortcut to get back into it. So I don't recommend doing that. But if you're like one of those people that are coming from Modo or perhaps from Blender, and the menus are on the right hand side, and you like that, knock yourself out. I'm kind of weird like this way. I prefer my software menus to be on the left side for Lightwave, but in Fusion everything's on the right, and I actually have my taskbar stuck on this side of the screen most of the time. And because I work with a 3 monitor setup, I'm almost always shoving that bar off to the monitor on my immediate right. So whatever your preference is, that's up to you. Wireframe smoothing, viewport monitor, whatever you need to do. You customize your interface colors. Make it look more like another product if you want, or just customize it to your own taste. Then you get your display options. Display your origin only. Show subpatch cages if you want. Show fog circles. Very similar stuff. This is just where it's been moved to. Okay. General, motion, spline, your gizmos, GPU functions for your OpenGL shading and whatnot, camera views and your overlays. So if you're looking for your harmonious triangles, your golden selections, rule of thirds, that's all under camera view now in this new tab. Shortcut key for it though is the same. So if you want to bring this window up at any point in time, just hit D and it'll bring it up. There are your defaults, how long your scene length is, what your frame size preset is. It's all in here for sure for you to find. Edit mode, with your objects, lights, bones as preference. And then your OBJ format options. These are very important now because there's some new tools that will allow you to do some really interesting tricks with the LD Tools kit. And of course, paths. Paths is something that was introduced in the 2018 cycle. Some of it is a little bit new to people. Other people might not be. But if you want to go in and create auto paths in a particular directory or auto custom paths, and you want to build a new content directory, this is where it is. And you can edit your preset location for that project or whatever you want. Very good stuff. Very handy. All right, now, so that's one of the main things that's changed. I'm going to actually just go back and move my toolbar to the left because that's the way I like it. Again, just D key to open that thing back up. Oh, D key. And we should also talk about the render properties panel. And the render properties panel, Control P to bring it up. You'll notice that we've lost the camera properties in this tab. It used to be part of that. I do kind of miss that. I wish it was part of this, but because these options are quite extensive now, it kind of makes sense for this window to be on its own. Although I still think that it would be great if we could just have the camera properties panel sitting in here like we have before. But that's just me. Let's talk a little bit about how this panel has changed significantly. Let's go to the render panel, first of all. And you'll see here, you now have drop downs for Lightwave's VPR and Lightwave Octane Render. I'm not much of an Octane user, so I'm not going to worry too much about that in this video, so don't worry about it. If you don't, you can have it set up. If you've got your Octane Prime account going, you can get Octane inside of Lightwave and run it for a single GPU. Great stuff for those people who love working with Octane. All right, so Very similar ray trace shadows, reflections, refraction, rendered lines, instances, enablement mapping, whether you want it on or off. I'm going to turn it off in this case. But what is diffuse bounces, for example? Well, diffuse bounces actually relates to the new way of doing radiosity and how that actually will translate into your workflow. Um, think about it as uh, one bounce would effectively just like be regular lighting, and then anything above that would be an evaluation for a second, third, fourth, fifth bounce. Two is generally enough in most scenes. Some people, if they're doing arc viz, they'll probably push this up to like 4 or 8 because of the interiors, but there are other things to consider there. Ray trace recursion, this is actually picked up by the original scene. We never cranked this anywhere past 4, and if we did, it would be the default of 6. The transparency recursion limit has been picked up as that, so that's been 6. And our ray trace recursion for reflection and refraction is set at 4. And we see that the ray precision, which has been a function that's been with us since the beginning of time, is still also default 6. Reflection samples and refraction samples are global, but we now have per surface overrides for samples. So you don't have to throw a bunch of samples at your render to get it to clean up if you've got refraction or reflection artifacting or aliasing or something that's like a little sparkly firefly. Don't just throw reflection or refraction samples at it. Go into the surface that's causing the problem and up the actual samples on that instead, because there's an override in the surface editor for it. So for example, shading model, if we had a problem surface, we'd hit reflection or refraction overrides and punch in a number. Now, you're probably going to be a little bit upset to realize that the shading system that used to be under an extra tab in the surface editor has gone bye-bye. The shading filters in previous versions of Lightwave that are available from both the native product and as well as third-party developers were fantastic. There are lots of amazing products out there that take advantage of the new system, but also were very, very handy in the old system. There's generally, because of the new physical beast renderer, a replacement for it. So those other technologies are redundant, but there are products out there on the market for Lightwave that bring certain aspects of those functions found in those third-party plugins for shading surfaces back into the software, but they're typically going to be available as nodes. So this is where you're going to get into your node editor, unless you're going to just work with the standard material. This is what the shader is currently set to for the entire object. Now let's talk about how the global illumination tab has changed. It's become very simplistic because we really only have 2 types of global illumination algorithms for solving GI. One is just brute force, which frankly works really great, and then there's an irradiance cache, which will be a little bit more complicated for me to explain in these videos, but there's a great section in the manual that explains it, and you'll have to experiment with it. However, it's not for something like space scenes. Using radiosity and global illumination in space scenes was extremely rare. It was extremely costly 20 years ago on the machines that we had, and it really didn't, punch things up all that much. We were able to do amazing work by using other means and other methods. So this really doesn't need to change much, but you do have the control over things like caustics, affected by volumetrics, because volumetrics can now properly contribute to radiosity or global illumination, and of course, how many rays you want to pump into the scene when it's doing an evaluation for GI. All right, now let's talk about the volumetrics tab. This is where you're also going to see that things have changed significantly because we didn't have a volumetrics tab really before. We've got something that's quite different. In order to see volumetrics in Lightwave using the old system, and it has detected this automatically, we've got use legacy volumetrics. The reason why that popped up is because under scene, under image processing, we've got hypervoxels activated. So it recognized that if you're going to use hypervoxels in here, fortunately I didn't bring the hypervoxels effect over. in the assembly in the first place. So, but it still detects it as a filter. It's going to automatically enable use legacy volumetrics. Now, for me to convert the engines and say the guns over using the new volumetric system, this needs to be off, and then we need to enable volumetric scattering. We can do volumetrics as a secondary effector pass, so we can leave it there. It won't do any harm. Let's talk about the compositing side here. Using backdrop image obviously works as it did in previous versions. One of the developers prior to 2018 did the great service to the community by having a used background color, so you don't longer have to use a black.bmp or black.png image to blank out the background from your camera. If you want to use a backdrop that's different, that's contributing to radiosity or GI or reflections. This is also the same. We've got textured environment as a tab, and I've got my pitch in there. So all this stuff basically came over intact, including the flare to alpha. You'll see that this panel hasn't changed much. You still have Gaussian blur, bilinear, limit dynamic range functions, and you also now have a tone map function, fiber filters, halftone, pixel filters, and of course, a slew of additional filters that many of which in my case are a mix of third party and the native filters. So for example, I want to use Star Pro on this, so I may activate that. But pretty much the same stuff. Now, we no longer have a backdrop in here that's going to effectively contribute to radiosity. So let's go and look through the camera here. And I'm going to enable VPR so we can see what's going on. Well, what's going on here? Well, what we've done is because we've enabled legacy volumetrics with volumetric scattering, lights in here in our scene by default are all going to affect volumetrics. So we need to go through and turn off ones that really don't make sense, such as key. This will be the big one, but it'll be among one of the ones that has to be turned off. You'll see the change there. And we're going to turn effect volumetrics off on that. The ones that are really killing us, though, are going to be these distant lights, because distant lights in Lightwave really shouldn't have volumetrics like the way that was done originally. Really didn't make a lot of sense in that case. But let's take a look at the muzzle flash. Let's turn that off for the moment. Turn that off for the moment. It's these edges. So there we got it. Okay, now let's take a quick look at what's going on here. We don't have a lot of light going on the radar like we had on the version that was in 2015. So what's happening here? Well, by default, normally when you open the Lightwave for the first time, you're going to get two lights. You're going to get a light, which would just be a standard distant light, and a thing called an environment light. We don't have one in here because when we loaded this in, it already had lights in it, so it didn't bring in another environment light. That would be kind of weird. So if we want to use the background that we currently have in the scene and use it to light the radar, we need to add it ourselves. So we're going to go and create an environment light called Enviro. I like to keep his name short. And now we've got something here. We don't want it to affect volumetrics. And we're going to use global. You can see there's a preview of it looking at the global background. So this light is basically looking at this function here. So it's looking at that gradient tied to pitch in the background once it's using global or use global. Now, you don't necessarily have to use global. You can actually take this, say copy this current layer, Go over here, hit add texture environment. You'll notice that you can pretty much plug anything that you would normally have over here in the environment over to here directly to a light. This gives you the ability to add more than one environment light and then have, using object or light exclusions, objects lit by different environments in the same scene. Very interesting stuff. So we can bring this up. Boop. And we can paste, replace current layer. There we go. So if I use global there, because it's the same, won't make a difference. But now we've got something that is being lit by that environment light, and we don't even really need radiosity on. No real change there. Now we have these other lights in here, which are these guns, that if I scrub through, they're obviously flashing. Because they're distant lights, it's going to be a little bit bizarre because they're volumetric lights based off of a distant light. If you know anything about distant lights, they have no positional information that exists in a scene, really. They only have rotation. So these lights need to be, for the moment, just turned off. We'll get to converting them later. All right, so there's our key light. Default 100% equivalent in Lightwave 2024 or Lightwave 2018 and up is 3.14. So if that was our default light, that's our default light equivalent for 100% in here now. Okay, and of course that environment light, it's good to go. And then one last thing is our Cylon radar eye. Because this is a point light, it's not going to look wonky or weird when it's in our scene. This is a different light property. So the first thing for us to tackle really here to get this thing converted is our engines. So we'll take a break and we'll come right back and we'll get that done.